Thanks very much, Ruchir, once again. You have, again, delightfully for us, using your 10 rules matrix, you've been able to analyze the Indian economy. And, I was sitting at the back taking notes, and I did a quick sort of, I did a simple average, because you were giving points on each of the metrics.
Right.
And India's sort of points out of 10 are, when we do a simple average, comes to about 5.
Right.
Which would suggest that we're not doing too bad, and perhaps at the same time there's a lot of work left to be done. So it pretty much mirrors what you've said. India has disappointed both the pessimists and the optimists. Let's start with the first rule that you've laid out for us, the disconnect or the lack of correlation between politics and economics. And I find that a little counterintuitive, because in a garrulous democracy like India, we expect politics to pretty much dominate everything, especially economics. And at a time when jobs has become such a sort of a worrying sign for the youth, your analysis shows that since 91, there will be a 50% chance of a state chief minister who's delivered more than 8% growth actually losing the elections. Have you been able to figure out, why this is the case?
No, I think that the default mode in India is basically throw the bums out. Yeah. So like ever since the multi-party democracy took root in India in the late 1970s, 2 out of 3 governments have been thrown out of power, like in India. And I think that, so to me, that's the default mood. And why that happens is, I think, questionable. I think that you're some seasoned politicians, maybe you can help answer that. But I think that the issue is that why that happens is really questionable in terms of, but I think it tells you that there are so many factors which go into an election out here that is very hard to know in terms of what is the exact factor that is leading to, for example, like in Bihar's election, like we know it, that it was basically because you had 2 parties which came together, they were able to win. If he had fought alone in 2015, despite a very good economic performance, he would have lost that election in 2015. So I think that to me is the real issue, which is the fact that the political arithmetic, the caste arithmetic, passions of nationalism, and also maybe aspirations that people are still suffering from huge levels of poverty and distress, that the natural default is, even with 8% growth, it's not enough to cure that.
I'm just curious to know what is perhaps then the implication. What's the big takeaway, let's say, for politicians? Mr. Shukla is also here, but what's the big takeaway? How should politicians then read the analysis, that Morgan Stanley has thrown up in terms of, economic growth is important, but, there are a lot of other factors that go into determining, the mindset and the way in which the voters would actually go ahead and vote.
Yeah. No, I think that there is no sort of, so I think that that's why there is no great incentive to carry out any big bang reform ever, because the dividends that you get out of it are quite limited. So I think that's what it is. Now, maybe someone takes the punt that you really move India to 10, 11% economic growth and you're able to then sort of reap the dividends. But I feel that the progress is still not enough over a 5-year time horizon to really make a difference. As far as growth is concerned.
Because the term that had come into vogue was good economics is also good politics.
Yeah.
So you're saying
it's a cute phrase, and it works in many countries. I'm not sure it works here.
Because your analysis has also shown that there is a correlation between politics and economics in some of the other emerging markets, but not so in India.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Because talking about demonetization, and I think that's where you've written in one of your recent pieces also, that how that essentially exemplifies how allegedly bad economics can be very good, politically for a leader.
Yes.
But at the same time, you're saying good economics is not necessarily bad, is not necessarily good politics. How do you then reconcile the two, what appears to be seemingly contradictory sort of?
No, so contradictory. As I said, that it is that do not make a link between the two. The two are just independent things. The good thing in India is that when the government's in office, when ministers are in power, they do the basic good for the economy. I feel that the responsibility of the chair is such that they do end up doing the basic stuff. They want to be seen to be doing the right things. They want to be seen to be moving. But it's all very incremental in nature. There is no big incentive out here that you're going to change the system in a big way from an economic standpoint, and you're going to reap the political dividends for that. So I think that's what it is. And populism still works. Again, we went to Tamil Nadu, I remember, last year on our election trips in 2016. And it was shocking to see as to how much populism there was in Tamil Nadu and how the growth prospects of Tamil Nadu had been very severely affected by the kind of populism that had been there, from some of it, including with lots of including with rampant alcoholism, etc., being, out there. And yet, Tamil Nadu, in terms of, she won a re-election, because despite the very poor economic state of Tamil Nadu. So it seems that populism still works more than any of these factors in terms of determining electoral outcomes. But yet the basic responsibility that a person has when he or she is in chair, ensure that not too much damage is done in terms of what's going on. And so this incremental reform path continues.
Over the question of how meddlesome a state is, and I would be really curious to know, because I'll be throwing open the floor for questions after this, what industry thinks about the point that you made, which is that how often can industry speak about the government openly, in a factual position in this case. How big a threat do you think that is for India's growth prospects, and how important is it for industry, for media also, to sort of, show the mirror to the government what the ground reality is?
So two sides of me. One is a Democrat, and one is the pragmatist. The pragmatist tells you there's no relationship, again, between whether a country is democratic or authoritarian and what the economic outcome is. So you look at China, Korea, these economies, they were all authoritarian regimes, and yet they were able to deliver very high economic growth over time. So it just depends on the whims and fancies of the leadership. If they get the policy mix right, then you get the right outcome. If they get the policy mix wrong, and you have no one to show you a mirror, then the outcome tends to be very bad. But the average tends to be similar, whether it's a democracy or an authoritarian regime. So of course, as a democratic, I would like the fact that we can all speak freely and openly about what's happening. But the honest truth is, in many emerging markets, and India is not an exception out here, it is not possible for business people to speak openly about how a government is doing in a very open way. That's because there's always the threat that some branch of government will get annoyed with you, and they'll be, like as I said, in India's case, we know well, to follow 50% of the rules, you have to break the other 50%. Right? So, and in China,
that's what they say about the labor laws as well in India.
Yes, but for most of these things, you just have, that's just the way the operating environment is. In China's case, it's very similar. It's what we call the original sin. Like in China's case, at the government there, so to make your first big buck in China, you have to do something, which is not exactly in alignment with the rules of that country. But the government always has that on you, so that it can always use it against you if you basically don't toe the line of the government. So that is just a political reality. Even some of the tech CEOs, even in China, that's a very new economy. Even they tell me that given that how much time they have to spend basically educating the government about the importance of tech and what happens out there. But I think this is true in many economies. So as a Democrat, I wish we could all speak more openly, but the reality is that the laws and the regulations of the country are such where there's always this threat, which is that if you say something out of line, you can always get in trouble for it.
Because now a new brand that has come up, since Prime Minister Modi took charge, was Modinomics, representing his style of politics and his style of sort of, running the economy. Do you think Modinomics is very closely sort of related to, Beijing consensus? And I remember you were critical of that. Post the global financial crisis, everybody was looking at the Beijing consensus that, this is the sort of model that we need to follow, move over the Washington consensus. So in that sense, do you feel that Modinomics, which is again, very, where decision making is driven by the Prime Minister's office, and where you've also talked about how the World Value Survey talks about how even people want more autocratic or authoritarian leaders. Do you think that way there is a close resemblance between Modinomics and Beijing consensus?
I think this Modinomics is a media creation. I don't think he's gone up, I don't think the Prime Minister has gone about saying that this is what Modinomics is. I'm not sure there is such a sort of holistic vision about what the exact thing is. But having said that, I'm not sure that, as I said that here, that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Chinese reforms. What we tend to really underappreciate it is how many bold reforms China took, the state took. Do you know that from the mid-1990s until the middle of the last decade, China laid off 70 million people in its public sector enterprises. 70 million people. So I think there's this understanding that China's reform model is about the Beijing consensus is what came to be in the last few years when they were trying to prop growth up after the global economic meltdown. But if you look at the Chinese reform process starting with Deng Xiaoping, a lot of that reform was about really taking some very bold reform measures which could have been quite politically destabilizing. One was the entire policy of creating these SEZs, where a lot of the labor was almost pushed and migrated to these SEZs, like to the coastal areas, to generate growth. There was a huge mass movement, which could have been quite destabilizing for a country, of hundreds of millions of people moving to more coastal areas in search of these job opportunities created by the government. So in many ways, China's development model was very much about getting out of the way. So if you look at the share of the public sector in China, or the state, when Deng Xiaoping began his reforms, the state had virtually 100% control over the economy. Today, the state control over the economy in terms of how much is produced by the state is down to 40%. So I think there's a misunderstanding about China's reform process. A lot of China's reform process was about getting out of the way, about sort of withdrawing from different sectors, from starting, albeit from a very high level. And today it is down to about 40%.
So therefore, do you think these comparisons that, there is an ad nauseum about India and China is totally misplaced? Because in a democratic polity, really pulling off a reform like that, displacing 70 million people, would be unthinkable.
Absolutely. So that's why, I think there is some truth to that. And of course, as I said, if someone were willing to gamble and do something else, maybe we see different results. But therefore, I agree. So therefore, I keep saying, when people keep expecting big reforms in India, big bang reforms, I say that those like reform expectations are very misleading. That's not going to happen in this sort of a democratic polity.